The sun hammered down on the wheat fields of Kansas, turning the horizon into a shimmering blur of heat and dust. It was late afternoon, and the air was thick with the smell of dry chaff and diesel fumes. In the middle of that golden ocean, 20 men stood in a line. They held machetes and scythes. Their knuckles were white. Their faces were grim, streaked with sweat and dirt. They were young, fit, and disciplined, and they were speaking German. Imagine for a second that you are an American farmer in 1944. Your brother is fighting in France. Your neighbor's son died on Omaha Beach. And yet, right here in your backyard, the enemy is holding a blade. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten shadows of history, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, because today we are walking a very thin line between war and peace. It was the peak of World War II. The United States was suffering from a critical labor shortage. Millions of able-bodied American men were overseas, leaving farms, canneries, and factories empty. The harvest was rotting in the fields. The solution was desperate and dangerous. The government decided to bring the prisoners of war to the American heartland. By 1945, there were over 400,000 German POWs on American soil. They weren't just locked in cells. They were harvesting corn in Nebraska, picking cotton in Texas, and canning tomatoes in Indiana. Thomas gripped the steering wheel of his Ford truck until his hands hurt. He watched the group of prisoners climb off the back of the transport lorry. They wore denim uniforms with 2 large letters stamped on the back in white paint, PW, Prisoner of War. Thomas spat out the window. He didn't want them here. He had fought the temptation to bring his shotgun. The military guard, a bored-looking sergeant named Miller, walked over to the truck window. He lit a cigarette, shielding the flame from the prairie wind. "They're all yours, Tom," Miller said, smoke drifting into the cab. 8 hours. Keep them hydrated. Don't let them wander." "I don't need Nazis on my land, Miller," Thomas replied, his voice low. "I need Americans." "There aren't any," Miller said flatly. "It's them or the rot. Make a choice." Thomas looked at the men. They didn't look like the monsters he saw in the newsreels. They looked tired. They looked curious. One of them, a tall blonde kid who couldn't have been more than 19, was staring at the vastness of the horizon with wide eyes. Thomas put the truck in gear. "Get them to the north field," he grunted. The work was brutal. The Kansas sun was unforgiving, and the wheat was heavy. Thomas watched them like a hawk. He expected laziness. He expected sabotage. He expected them to throw tools into the thresher or crush the stalks. But they didn't. They fell into a rhythm. It was a military rhythm. They worked with a precision that was almost mechanical. Slash, bundle, stack, slash, bundle, stack. They moved faster than the local crews ever had. The tall kid, the one who had stared at the horizon, was working near the fence line. His name was Werner. Thomas knew this because he had heard the others calling him. Werner paused to wipe his forehead with a rag. He looked over at Thomas. There was no hatred in his eyes, just a strange sort of resignation. In his diary, captured later by camp authorities, a prisoner named Hans working in a similar camp wrote, "The vastness of this land is terrifying. There are no fences here, only endless space. If I ran, where would I go? The farmer looks at us like we are wolves. But the food. Today, we ate meat. Real meat. I have not seen such a portion in 3 years. By noon, the heat was unbearable. Thomas signaled for a break. He had brought a cooler of water and a basket of apples. It was a requirement, not a kindness. He set it down on the tailgate of the truck and stepped back, hand hovering near his belt. The prisoners approached slowly. They didn't rush. They waited for permission. Werner stepped forward first. He took a metal ladle of water, drank, and then nodded to Thomas. "Danke," Werner said. Thomas didn't respond. He just stared. "You speak English?" Thomas asked, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. "A little," Werner said. "School." "You from Berlin?" "Hamburg," Werner replied. "My father. He works in a shipyard." "My brother is a mechanic," Thomas said, almost involuntarily. "He's in Europe." The air suddenly felt very heavy. The mention of Europe brought the war crashing back into the quiet field. "I hope he comes home," Werner said softly. Thomas stiffened. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to scream that it was Werner's people who were trying to kill his brother. But the boy standing in front of him was covered in Kansas dust, holding a ladle of water, looking just as exhausted as any American boy would be. "Get back to work," Thomas snapped. The afternoon brought a shift in the weather. The sky to the west turned a bruised purple. The wind picked up, whipping the wheat into a frenzy. A storm was coming, a bad one, and half the field was still uncut. If the hail hit the standing wheat, the crop would be destroyed. The farm would face ruin. Thomas cursed and ran toward the tractor. The old International harvester was temperamental. He cranked it. Nothing. He cranked it again. The engine coughed and died. Smoke poured from the exhaust manifold. "No, no, no!" Thomas yelled, kicking the tire. The prisoners stopped working. They leaned on their scythes, watching the farmer struggle. The guard, Miller, was asleep in his jeep 300 yards away. Thomas popped the hood. He knew engines, but this was a cracked distributor cap. He didn't have a spare. He was done. The crop was gone. He slumped against the grill, the wind tearing at his hat. He felt a presence beside him. He flinched, turning around. It was Werner. The prisoner was looking into the engine bay. He pointed a dirty finger at the distributor. "Crack," Werner said. "Yeah, I see it," Thomas spat. "Get back to the line." Werner didn't move. He looked around, scanning the ground. Then he looked at the wire fence holding the cattle in the adjacent pasture. He pointed at the toolbox in the back of Thomas's truck. "Tape?" Werner asked. "And wire?" "It won't hold," Thomas said, shaking his head. "It will hold," Werner said. His voice was firmer now. "I fix trucks in Russia. We fix everything with nothing." Thomas looked at the storm clouds rolling in like a dark tide. He looked at the German soldier. He had a choice. He could maintain the line between enemy and patriot and lose his livelihood. Or he could trust the enemy. Thomas reached into the truck bed and grabbed the electrical tape and a pair of pliers. He handed them to Werner. For 20 minutes, the two men worked shoulder to shoulder. The German boy's hands were quick and sure. He bypassed the crack, rerouted the spark, and wrapped the casing so tight it looked like a black cocoon. "Try," Werner said, stepping back, wiping grease onto his pant leg. Thomas climbed into the seat. He turned the key. The engine roared to life. It wasn't pretty, but it was running. Thomas looked down from the cab. Werner was smiling. It was a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes. "Get the others!" Thomas shouted over the roar of the engine. "We have to finish before the rain." What happened next was a blur of motion. The hierarchy dissolved. There were no guards and no prisoners. There were just men fighting nature. Thomas drove the tractor, pulling the binder. The Germans ran behind, shocking the wheat, throwing the bundles into the wagon. They worked like a machine. The wind howled, stinging their faces with grit. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 10 minutes, but they didn't stop. Another prisoner, a burly man named Fritz, slipped and twisted his ankle. He went down with a cry. Before Thomas could even stop the tractor, 2 other Germans had hauled him up. They didn't let him sit. They supported his weight, and he kept stacking with one hand. They were racing the first drops of rain. As the last row was cut and the last bundle thrown onto the wagon, the sky opened up. Cold, hard rain lashed down, turning the dust to mud instantly. But the barn was full. The crop was safe. They huddled inside the barn, the sound of the rain deafening on the tin roof. The air inside was warm and smelled of sweet hay. Thomas sat on a bale, breathing hard. The prisoners were slumped against the far wall, exhausted. Miller, the guard, finally came running in, his poncho soaked, looking confused. "What happened?" Miller shouted. "I fell asleep. Is everyone accounted for?" Thomas looked at the group of Germans. They were soaked, dirty, and shivering. Werner was looking at his hands, still stained with American grease. "They're all here," Thomas said. He stood up and walked over to the cooler. It was empty. He walked to the cupboard in the tack room where he kept his emergency stash. He pulled out a carton of cigarettes and a bag of jerky. He walked over to Werner and tossed the items into his lap. "Hey!" Miller barked, hand moving to his holster. "You can't give them contraband, Tom." Thomas turned to the guard. His eyes were hard. "They saved the crop, Miller." "Shut up." Miller hesitated, looked at the size of the Germans, looked at the determination in Thomas's face, and slowly took his hand off his pistol. Werner opened the cigarettes. He didn't take one for himself first. He passed the pack down the line. Each man took one. Then Werner took one. "Thank you," Werner said. "Don't get used to it," Thomas replied. But the edge was gone from his voice. That night, in the barracks at the nearby camp, Werner wrote in a letter to his mother, "Dear Mama, today I fixed a tractor. The farmer is a hard man, like father, but he gave us tobacco. It is strange. When the rain falls, it falls on all of us the same. I do not think I want to be a soldier anymore. I just want to be a mechanic." The war didn't end that day. The prisoners stayed for another year. They continued to work the fields. The tension remained, but the fear was gone. They were still the enemy on paper, but on the dirt of that Kansas farm, they had become something else. They had become hands, strong, capable hands that rebuilt what the war was trying to destroy. When the war ended in 1945, the repatriation began. It was a slow process. Most German POWs were sent to Britain or France for forced labor to rebuild the cities they had bombed. It would be years before Werner saw Hamburg again. Years later, in 1952, Thomas received a letter. The envelope was rough, and the stamp was German. Inside was a photograph of a small repair shop with a sign that read, "Werner's Auto Repair." On the back, In neat, slanted handwriting, it read, "The trick with the tape still works. Thank you for the cigarettes. War creates heroes. We know that. It creates villains. We know that too. But in the quiet spaces between the battles, in the cornfields of Nebraska and the orchards of Oregon, it created something rare. It created a moment where the uniform didn't matter as much as the work. Historical records confirm that without the labor of these 400,000 men, the American agricultural economy might have collapsed in 1944 and 1945. They saved the harvest that fed the troops who were fighting their own brothers. It is one of history's great ironies. The enemy helped win the war against themselves, simply by doing the one thing they knew how to do best: work. If you want more forgotten stories of real people who lived through the chaos of World War II, subscribe. This channel exists to bring their voices back. War draws lines on a map. People erase them. This was one of those stories.